There is a moment in almost every man's story where he realizes that what he thought was intimacy was actually a casino. Beautiful lights, intoxicating music, and a sense that if he just stayed long enough, the next hand would finally make everything make sense. What he misses, often for years, is the unconscious mistake beneath it. He assumes the building was designed to welcome him. He assumes the warmth at the beginning meant something true about the structure itself. He assumes the confusion is his fault, not the architecture. But some structures are engineered to disorient, not to invite. Many men describe the early phase of a narcissistic bond as a hall of mirrors. Everything reflects admiration, resonance, possibility. Then one day, the temperature drops. Silence replaces praise. The lights flicker, and the mirrors distort. And he begins bargaining with the reflection instead of recognizing the trap. If you've ever felt that shift, from awe to vertigo, you're not alone. As Dr. Gabor Mate might say, your nervous system wasn't confused because you were weak. It was confused because the environment was inconsistent with safety. Survivors often speak of this period as feeling mentally concussed, fogged, scrambled, almost as if some internal compass stopped pointing north. And neuroscience supports this. Chronic relational stress can mimic the cognitive drag of mild traumatic injury. Attention narrows, memory fragments. You become hyper-focused on the other person's emotional weather and strangely numb to your own. When a man tells me he no longer trusts himself, I hear the echo of this neurological toll. It isn't personality collapse, it's overload. This is why some men stay psychologically entangled long after the breakup. It's not logic. It's a nervous system still answering to the old architecture, still waiting for the next unpredictable jolt of approval or punishment. Yet, and this is the part rarely spoken aloud, there exists a different kind of man, sometimes rare, sometimes forged by suffering, who steps out of that gravity with a steadiness that almost looks uneventful. At first glance, he seems unremarkable, but over time, he is the one who outlasts the narcissist, not through war, but through a quiet refusal to bleed for a game he never agreed to play. Jung might say that in this dynamic, the narcissist plays the corrupted king, power built on ritual humiliation, a throne secured by destabilizing those who approach it. And many men, especially those who grew up cushioning volatile parents, unconsciously step into the role of emotional sentinel. They anticipate storms, they absorb consequences, they protect others from eruptions. Devotion becomes indistinguishable from self-erasure. What looks like loyalty is often a survival strategy learned in childhood. But there is another archetype forming beneath the surface, the emergent sovereign. The man who refuses the role of jester, refuses the script of managing another person's chaos, refuses to participate in the theater. He may not know it at first, but the moment he stops performing, the narcissist's kingdom begins to shrink. Their early triumph, new faces, curated confidence, the appearance of momentum, fades over the years, while his quiet life slowly becomes spacious again. The narcissist burns bright and fast. He burns slow and steady, and in the long arc, steadiness wins. If you've ever wondered why she seemed to move on instantly while you were left shattered, consider this. One of you was living in a fortress built out of illusion, and the other lived in a body carrying the real cost of the connection. One of you was performing, the other was feeling. There's no shame in being the one who felt. There's only the invitation to understand what your nervous system was trying to protect you from. So stay with me, because midway through this video, we're going to uncover a subtle shift that most men overlook. A shift that turns the entire dynamic upside down. A shift that quietly collapses the narcissist's gravity. But first, we need to name the script you didn't realize you were performing in, and the wound that trained you to act it. There is a particular kind of man who enters a relationship believing he is simply being attentive, patient, or emotionally mature. What he doesn't see at first is that he has stepped into a familiar role, one he learned long before adulthood ever began. If the introduction revealed the architecture of the narcissistic bond, this chapter reveals the script he's been reciting without realizing it, not because he is naive, but because his earliest training taught him that peace is something you earn by managing someone else's storm. And this is the unconscious illusion many men carry, that their worth is measured by how effectively they stabilize the emotional weather around them. Imagine him in third person, because sometimes distance helps clarity. He becomes the stabilizer, the translator of moods, the one who softens the edges of truth as if truth itself were a hazardous material. He learns to read micro-expressions with the precision of a weather instrument. A slight shift in tone becomes a warning tremor. A pause becomes a forecast. His nervous system orients toward the other person's reactions the way a compass needles toward magnetic north. Not out of dependency, but out of survival conditioning. For him, conflict doesn't threaten the relationship. It threatens his function. And function, for a man like this, becomes synonymous with identity. He doesn't think, if she's upset, the relationship is struggling. Instead, he feels, if she's upset, I am failing. This is not weakness, it is programming. Many men who grew up with volatile or emotionally unpredictable caregivers learned early that their safety depended on reading the room faster than anyone else. Jung might call this a complex, a fused knot of memory, emotion, and meaning that takes over in milliseconds. Here is where trauma bonding enters, not as melodrama, but as neurology. The cycle of idealization, devaluation, and intermittent moments of reprieve mimics the rhythm of addiction. The brain begins to chase the unpredictable high, not the connection itself. Dopamine spikes not because love is deep, but because uncertainty is intoxicating. And the man caught in this loop often carries a hidden belief that shapes every decision. If he can just endure this chapter, the original version of her will return. He isn't addicted to the cruelty. He's addicted to the possibility of repair. That belief is the tether. It is the gravity. And it keeps him gambling long after the table has taken everything from him. From another angle, what he calls loyalty is often fear. Fear of being replaced, being revealed as insufficient, being exposed as ordinary. This fear leads him into over-explaining, preemptive clarifications, obsessive attempts to correct misunderstandings. He thinks he is preserving connection, but from the narcissist's vantage point, he becomes predictable. Trigger insecurity, watch him scramble. Withdraw warmth, watch him perform. His emotional responses turn into levers. There is a subtle but profound difference between love and vigilance. Most men in this position don't realize they've crossed that line. They think they are attached, but their body is actually bracing. Their nervous system is not bonding, it is surviving. And survivors often describe the same signals: relief instead of warmth when a neutral text comes in. Silence feeling more dangerous than cruelty. Fantasies revolving around proving worth rather than sharing life. One man described it as living on eggshells and calling it passion. Another said, I was hooked against logic. These aren't flaws in character. They are signs of scarcity conditioning. When you grow accustomed to emotional famine, even crumbs feel like nourishment. Here is the quiet, destabilizing truth that often lands hard. A system like this doesn't collapse when he leaves. It collapses when he stops performing. And before he reaches that point, many men pass through an intermediate stage, one that feels like awakening, but is still shaped by the original wound. A stage where he decides, with cold clarity, that he will never be vulnerable again, that he will become untouchable. The next chapter explores that shift, not as strength, but as the wound-wearing armor. There is a phase many men enter after the collapse of a narcissistic bond that feels, at first glance, like evolution. He tells himself he has finally woken up, finally toughened, finally free. But beneath the surface, something more complex is happening. It is not freedom. It is not clarity. It is the wound turning itself inside out. Imagine him speaking in first person, because this stage often feels intensely personal. After the discard, I vowed to never be vulnerable again. I spoke about connection like commerce. His tone becomes measured, strategic, even cold. To anyone watching, it appears as if he has gained control. He is focused, disciplined, uninterested in emotional entanglements. But if you listen closely, the tone is not sovereignty. It is petrification. In this stage, he envies what he believed the narcissist possessed: immunity to shame, the ability to detach instantly, the appearance of emotional invincibility. And in trying to replicate that, he imitates a mask rather than meeting his own truth. Flat effect, emotional distance, controlled indifference, small cruelties disguised as boundaries. He confuses the absence of feeling with the presence of power. This is where Jung's lens becomes clarifying. When someone suppresses their deeper emotion for too long, the shadow does not disappear. It takes command. What was once repressed now dictates from underneath. Instead of integrating his assertiveness or anger or fear of insignificance, he becomes governed by them. The shadow decides, and he merely performs. Sarcasm replaces honesty. Withdrawal replaces dialogue. Ambiguity becomes a shield. He is no longer escaping the old dynamic. He is reenacting its logic, only with himself in the starring role. There is a cultural fascination with this persona, the cold avenger, the man who rises from heartbreak by becoming untouchable. Films portray him as a hero. Songs celebrate him as victorious. But in the quiet of real life, this posture corrodes. Men in this stage describe endlessly rehearsing imaginary confrontations, monitoring their former partner's life, fantasizing about being seen as the one who finally stopped caring. It looks like strength, but it is tethered attention. The narcissist still occupies the inner theater, even if no one else can see the lights. One man described it as building a shrine to the wound, not out of devotion, but because he could not yet imagine a life without orienting around the injury. There is a subtle, destabilizing truth here. Avoidance can become a new form of obedience. Not feeling anything does not make him autonomous. It makes him reactive in reverse. Instead of moving toward connection, he moves away from it. Instead of offering intimacy, he withholds it. Instead of being manipulated, he manipulates his own emotional landscape into numbness. And in all of this, the narcissist's imprint remains the reference point. He is still orbiting the same star, only on the opposite side of the sky. This stage is important because it reveals a paradox. Hardness is not healing. It is a nervous system still in defense mode. It is armor worn so tightly that the man inside can barely breathe. Yet something begins to shift when fatigue replaces performance. When the armored stance no longer feels like strength, but like confinement. When the silence becomes heavy rather than protective. When numbness stops functioning as a shield and starts feeling like imprisonment. It is in that quiet discomfort that a different possibility emerges. Not resistance, not reenactment, but a new center of gravity entirely. The next chapter explores that turning point. The moment when the nervous system stops speaking the narcissist's language, and a man begins to reference himself again. There comes a moment, often subtle and rarely celebrated, when the man who once lived on emotional high alert notices something different happening inside him. It is not triumph. It is not revenge. It is not even confidence. It feels more like the nervous system exhaling after years of holding its breath. And this shift is rarely dramatic. It often appears uneventful, almost plain. Yet this is where the architecture begins to change. Picture him now in third person, not because he is disconnected, but because his own life is finally beginning to feel observable rather than chaotic. His emotional climate is no longer dictated by her silence, her approval, or her provocations. The old cues that once triggered panic or urgency now register as information rather than instructions. The text that would have sent him spiraling becomes a neutral stimulus. The silence that once felt like punishment becomes space. The moment of bait no longer dictates his next move. This is not indifference. It is reorientation. The wound itself begins to reorganize. Instead of managing external turbulence, he anchors into something internal. Ritual, discipline, contemplation, work that steadies rather than distracts. His days develop shape. His choices develop meaning. His attention begins to turn toward his own telos, the internal direction that Jung might call the deeper instinct toward individuation. And when attention returns to its rightful home, external chaos loses its command. There is a neurological dimension here that deserves to be named. Trauma bonds make calm feel wrong at first. For a man accustomed to intensity, consistency can feel like emptiness. Silence can feel like abandonment. Stability can feel suspicious. The brain, trained by erratic reinforcement, expects emotional intoxication. And when it doesn't receive it, the absence feels like loss rather than relief. But something important happens when he keeps returning to routine. Predictable behaviors begin supplying the very neurotransmitters that the relationship once monopolized. Dopamine from follow-through, oxytocin from community, serotonin from completion. The nervous system no longer depends on volatility for stimulation or relief. It begins to build its own equilibrium. A moment that often reveals this shift is what some survivors call the 24-hour bait delay. A message arrives, provocative, seductive, ambiguous, or weaponized. He pauses, not out of strategy, but because something inside no longer leaps to correct the narrative. And in that pause, he notices the body, the tightening in the chest, the impulse to explain, the instinct to restore peace. When he waits, even briefly, the emotional storm loses momentum. The moment exposes an uncomfortable truth. For years, he wasn't choosing her. His nervous system was choosing for him. That single realization, quiet, almost anticlimactic, becomes a hinge. It separates identity from conditioning, and into this hinge enters a philosophical reframe. Nietzsche once wrote, "Become who you are," a phrase often taken as inspiration but meant as precision. Becoming who you are is not a performance, it is an emergence. It is the slow creation of a self that moves from inner necessity rather than fear-based compliance. The man in this stage does not harden, he clarifies. He becomes less demonstrative and more intentional, less reactive and more rooted. His choices begin to answer to alignment rather than appeasement. This is the moment that destabilizes the narcissist's familiar patterns, because their influence relies on hijacking external orientation. When a man stops orienting outward, their tactics lose traction. And yet, an important question remains. What happens when this internal clarity meets the external test of someone attempting to re-enter his life? What happens when the new architecture encounters the old weather? The next chapter explores a lived example of that shift in motion, how quiet stability, not confrontation, dissolved the entire playbook. There is a version of this story that rarely appears in dramatic retellings because it doesn't look cinematic. It doesn't involve grand gestures or decisive ruptures. It begins instead with exhaustion, the kind that doesn't shout but settles in the bones. A man who once lived in constant hypervigilance slowly realizes he has been orienting his entire existence around someone who is no longer even present. For years, he monitored the smallest signs, the timestamp of her last online activity, the tone of her breath through the phone, the slight edge in her reactions. He apologized before offenses even existed, repaired problems that were never his, and felt responsibility for emotional climates he did not create. Hypervigilance disguised itself as devotion. And when the relationship ended, the vigilance did not. It intensified. Nights filled with insomnia, days punctured by intrusive replay, moments stolen by compulsive checking of her social media, as if information could provide closure. What interrupts this cycle is not a breakthrough, but a quiet recognition. One morning, he notices that nearly every choice he has made, what he eats, when he sleeps, where he goes, what he avoids, is still calibrated to an absence. The relationship ended, but the choreography remained, and that recognition, simple as it appears, becomes the first loosening of the knot. A different rhythm begins when he shifts his focus from managing someone else's world to inhabiting his own. Here, a psychological framework becomes useful: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Not as a formula, but as internal bearings. Autonomy emerges as one daily action that has nothing to do with her story. Competence arises in tasks that build momentum rather than distraction. Relatedness appears through communities of men who speak honestly about wounds, patterns, and individuation, placing his experience within a wider human context. Instead of shame, he feels orientation. Instead of confusion, he feels recognition. From the narcissist's perspective, this shift is nearly incomprehensible. The tactics that once produced reliable reactions now fall flat. Smears meet silence. Future promises meet boundaries. Emotional bait meets neutrality rather than performance. And because narcissistic dynamics rely on emotional extraction, a flat, calm, unreactive target becomes unprofitable. When the well stops producing water, the bucket stops returning. What is remarkable is that his neutrality is not born of hostility. It is born of reallocation. He is no longer withholding from her. He is investing in himself. The stage on which he once performed dissolves, not because he dramatically tears it down, but because he simply steps off it. Jung might call this the beginning of sovereignty, not dominance, not indifference, but stewardship. He becomes the custodian of his sleep, his focus, his boundaries, his silence. His energy turns inward, not as escape, but as authorship. Over time, scars remain, but the orbit dissolves. Life begins to unfold in chapters not defined by rupture or reunion, but by continuity. He no longer waits for her to change, or for the past to rewrite itself. He grows roots in the present, not fantasies in the future. And this evolution, though often quiet, is profound. It reveals something the early stages obscured, that healing does not always announce itself. Sometimes it appears in the way he closes a tab without checking again, the way he sleeps through the night, the way he speaks to himself with less urgency and more truth. This brings the story to a deeper question. If this shift is possible for one man, what is the underlying configuration that makes someone fundamentally unexploitable, uncolonizable, unreachable by narcissistic tactics? What traits form the architecture of a personality that outlasts manipulation entirely? The next chapter names that structure with clarity. There is a certain configuration of personality that a narcissist cannot truly penetrate, not because it is aggressive, not because it is guarded, but because it is internally defined. It is a structure shaped from the inside out, not the outside in. And when a man begins to inhabit this configuration, something subtle yet profound happens. The narcissist's tactics stop finding places to land. This is where the story shifts from recovery into architecture. The first trait is a quiet one. Low supply, high self-definition. He still feels deeply, but no longer performs those feelings as currency. His emotional life is his, not a product for someone else's consumption. His sense of identity doesn't swing with external approval or withdrawal. It is built from lived structure, integrity, ritual, work that aligns with who he is becoming. The absence of emotional excess doesn't make him cold. It makes him uncolonizable. Triangulation, guilt, and manufactured urgency lose their power because there is no empty space inside him waiting to be filled. The second trait is shadow integration, which rarely looks glamorous. He is not polished. He is not perfect, but he knows the shape of his own impulses. Anger, competitiveness, jealousy, none of these are hidden away or disowned. He has met them, named them, and folded them into his understanding of himself. And because of that, they cannot be used against him. The volatility he once romanticized now appears unrefined rather than mysterious. Boundaries cease to be dramatic gestures. They become structural features, the way load-bearing walls are structural, quiet, firm, necessary. The third trait is a shift in preference that often emerges after years of chaos. The old thrill of unpredictability fades. What once felt intoxicating now feels incoherent. He begins to recognize that his body no longer interprets intensity as intimacy. Chaos becomes a disqualifier, not a magnet. In early dating, he listens less to chemistry and more to how someone speaks about accountability. He no longer mistakes emotional fireworks for compatibility. What he seeks now is coherence, because coherence is what finally lets his nervous system rest. The fourth trait is something few people name, but many men live: long memory, short access. He doesn't erase the past to appear enlightened. He doesn't force forgiveness to seem spiritual. He remembers plainly, not to hold grudges, but to protect alignment. When the inevitable attempts at re-entry arrive, nostalgia, crises, rewritten histories, he may feel compassion, but the doorway does not reopen, not because he is hardened, but because the story has moved forward and cannot be rewritten. He has learned the machinery, and once learned, it cannot be unlearned. Taken together, these traits form a structure that makes exploitation unworkable. The narcissist's influence depends on emotional extraction, identity destabilization, and the manipulation of longing. But this configuration offers no foothold for those strategies. The man is not guarded. He is simply authored from within, and that internal authorship renders external manipulation theatrically small. The next chapter widens the lens, exploring why this architecture feels surprising for men raised in emotional volatility, and how the very scars they carry often signal proximity to this configuration rather than distance from it. When a man reaches this point, something fundamental shifts in his inner landscape. Not suddenly, not triumphantly, but steadily, like a government changing hands without spectacle. His emotional policies no longer answer to volatility. The narcissist no longer functions as a reference point. The internal architecture that once bent toward appeasement now bends toward coherence. And this is what it truly means to outlast someone. Not to defeat them, but to stop serving the economy they depend on. Outlasting is not about endurance. It is about no longer supplying attention, fear, hope, resentment, or longing. All of those were forms of currency. All of those fed the dynamic. When they dissolve, the system dissolves. The connection doesn't end in a single moment. It ends in the countless micro-moments where he chooses alignment over reenactment. The arc becomes visible in hindsight. Caregiver, avenger, self-led sovereign. Each stage necessary, each stage revealing what the previous one could not. And the enduring personality, the one that surprises even him, is not armored. It is regulated. It does not rely on overcorrection or suppression. It rests. It breathes. It acts from clarity, not compulsion. Growth here is rarely dramatic. It arrives in accumulated choices, in the quiet decision to rest instead of obsess, in the honest recognition of grief instead of performing indifference, in the ability to let a memory pass without collapsing into it. Healing does not demand a heroic moment. It asks for repeated contact with truth. And truth, when held gently, becomes stabilizing. A single image captures this final shift, stepping out of a rigged casino into daylight. Not because you finally won the game, but because you realized the only winning move was leaving the architecture. The noise fades behind you. The light feels unfamiliar at first, but slowly, your eyes adjust to clarity rather than distortion. Even then, certain imprints remain. Hypervigilance, caution around trust, tuning into emotional shifts faster than you'd like. These remnants are not signs of failure. They are the residue of protection, evidence of how hard your nervous system worked to safeguard you. And over time, these imprints stop defining your path and simply become part of the landscape you know how to navigate. In the end, your identity is not shaped by being discarded. It is shaped by what you learned about yourself while walking through the machinery. You are the one who saw the illusion from the inside. You are the one who stepped back into authorship. And authorship, once awakened, rarely disappears. If any part of this traced a chapter of your own experience, one line shared in the comments can help another man recognize the moment his life stopped orbiting someone else's gravity.